home. What's going on?
I asked you a question. You fit the description, and people like you always think you can talk your way out.
I haven't done anything.
That's what you all say. Turn around before I make you.
You're making a serious mistake.
She was a federal attorney, 13 years defending constitutional rights. That morning, she was loading luggage in her own driveway. What happened in the next 11 minutes destroyed careers, triggered a federal criminal investigation, and cost the agency $4.6 million. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. These stories need to be told. They don't stay visible without you. Saturday morning, 6:22 a.m. Richmond, Virginia, inside one of the most exclusive gated communities in the metro area. Denise Caldwell stood alone in her driveway, loading luggage into the back of a black SUV. She was 56 years old. For 13 years, she had served as a federal attorney with the United States District Court, specializing in constitutional rights and immigration law. She had won 24 of 27 civil rights cases. The American Bar Association had honored her twice. That morning, she was heading to Dulles International Airport to deliver the keynote address at a federal legal conference on constitutional protections in immigration enforcement. A travel mug of coffee rested on the roof of the car. A leather attaché case sat on the curb packed with sealed federal court documents. Everything about the scene was ordinary, a woman leaving her home on a quiet weekend morning. At 6:24, three unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans turned onto her street and rolled to a stop directly in front of her driveway, blocking her vehicle completely. 6 agents in tactical vests exited in formation. The letters ICE were printed across their chests. The lead agent was Marcus Holt, 45 years old, 18 years in federal law enforcement, 9 formal complaints from communities of color filed against his unit over 6 years. Every single one documented, not one acted upon. He approached Caldwell with his hand resting on his sidearm. His posture was wide, his jaw was set. She had no idea what was coming. Holt spoke first. "You match the description of a person of interest in an active immigration enforcement operation. I need to see identification now." Caldwell set her jacket on the bumper. Her voice carried the precision of someone who had spent over a decade in federal courtrooms. "I'm attorney Denise Caldwell. I'm a federal attorney with the United States District Court. This is my home." Holt's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the SUV, then back at her. "Sure you are." He turned his head toward the agent behind him. "She's being evasive. Watch her hands." Her credentials didn't matter. Her words didn't matter. He had already decided who she was the moment he pulled onto her street. Caldwell did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She spoke the way she had spoken in federal courtrooms for 13 years, with the kind of calm that made powerful men sit still and listen. "Do you have a warrant?" Holt said nothing. "Under the Fourth Amendment, you are required to present a warrant before conducting any search or seizure on private property. You are standing on my driveway. You have not identified a crime. You have not presented any legal authorization. As a matter of law, you do not have the authority to detain me." She paused, letting the silence do its work. "I'm also advising you that under 18 U.S.C. 111, assault on a federal officer is a federal crime, and under 18 U.S.C. 1512, obstruction of judicial process carries a separate federal charge." Every word was precise. Every citation was accurate. She wasn't guessing. She was building a case in real time, standing in her own driveway in yoga pants at 6:30 in the morning. Holt stepped closer, close enough that his tactical vest nearly pressed against her shoulder. "I don't answer to you. Turn around now." 13 years of case law versus 18 years of unchecked authority. And the authority wasn't listening. Across the street, a porch light clicked on. A door opened. A man stepped out into the early morning air bathrobe, untied slippers on wet grass, phone already raised in recording. His name was Colonel Raymond Selby, 70 years old, retired United States Air Force, 30 years of military service, 3 overseas deployments, 2 commendations from the Secretary of Defense. He had lived 3 houses down from Denise Caldwell for nearly a decade. He had been to her home for dinners. He knew her name, her career, and exactly what she did for a living. He crossed the street fast for his age. His finger pointed directly at Holt. "That's Attorney Caldwell. What the hell are you doing?" Holt turned. "Sir, step back now, or you will be detained for obstruction of a federal operation." Selby did not move, not one step. Behind him, through the front window of his home, his wife was already on the phone with 911. her voice shaking as she described what she was watching from her living room. The first witness was in place. Holt didn't care. A second figure appeared from 3 doors down, walking fast across the wet grass. Irene Chavis, 48 years old, tenured professor of constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center, a published scholar on Fourth Amendment protections and federal overreach, a woman who had argued before appellate courts and had known Denise Caldwell for 6 years as a neighbor and a friend. She stepped onto the driveway and spoke directly to Holt. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the precision of a courtroom. "I know this woman. She is a federal attorney with the United States District Court. You are violating 18 U.S.C. 111, which prohibits assault on a federal officer, and 18 U.S.C. 1512, which prohibits obstruction of judicial process. Uncuff her immediately." Holt's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, leave now, or you will be placed under arrest." Chavis held her phone steady at chest level. The camera pointed directly at his face. "I'm a constitutional law professor at Georgetown. I'm not leaving, and neither is my camera." Two experts on the same driveway, both citing the same federal statutes, both ignored by the same man. They were still standing in the driveway. 7 minutes had passed since the Suburbans arrived. What came next would change everything. Agent Lydia Voss, 33 second in command, 9 years of never questioning the lead agent on any operation, moved silently behind Caldwell. She positioned herself at the attorney's left shoulder, cutting off any path of retreat. Holt grabbed Caldwell's right arm and spun her body toward the SUV. The motion was fast and violent. Her shoulder struck the side mirror with a dull crack that echoed across the quiet street. The coffee mug slid off the roof and shattered on the driveway. She didn't scream. She didn't swing. She planted her feet and said it clearly, loud enough for every agent and every neighbor now standing outside to hear, "I am a federal attorney. You are making a serious mistake." She had said it before. She would not have to say it again. Voss grabbed her left arm and wrenched it behind her back. Together they forced her forward, pressing her chest against the hood of her own vehicle. The metal was still cold from the morning air. Holt snapped the cuffs on. He ratcheted them tighter than necessary. Caldwell's cheek pressed against the pane. Her reading glasses fell from her head and cracked on the concrete. 7 neighbors stood on the street, 4 phones recording from 4 different angles, red lights blinking steady. Colonel Selby pressed his phone to his ear and spoke loudly, deliberately, making sure his voice carried, "I am reporting an unlawful arrest in progress. A federal attorney is in handcuffs in her own driveway. No warrant. Send local police immediately." At the back of the formation, the youngest agent on the team stood motionless. Jordan Pace, 30 years old, 14 months out of the academy. His face was pale. He leaned toward Voss and whispered, "We need to stop." Voss didn't look at him. Her jaw tightened. "Shut up." The cameras caught everything. They always did. Without a word of explanation, the agents began searching Caldwell's vehicle. No consent was given. No warrant was produced. No inventory sheet was started. They opened the rear hatch and pulled out her suitcase, unzipping it on the driveway. They went through her clothes, her toiletry bag, her shoes. Everything spread across the concrete in plain view of the growing crowd. They opened her purse and emptied it onto the hood beside her. Wallet, keys, lipstick, reading glasses case, all of it laid out like evidence against a woman who had committed no crime. Then they reached the attaché case. It was leather, combination locked. One of the agents forced it open. Inside were sealed federal court documents stamped with case numbers and classification markings. A federal bar credential issued by the Administrative Office of the United States Courts, and a laminated identification badge bearing her photograph, her name, and her title. Holt picked up the ID and held it in front of his face. The photo matched the woman on the hood. The name matched the name she had given. The seal was authentic, embossed, laminated, unmistakable. He stared at it. The silence lasted only a few seconds. But everyone watching felt it. The neighbors on the street, the agents behind him, the cameras still recording. The air shifted. The truth was sitting in his hand. But instead of uncuffing her, instead of stepping back and recognizing the magnitude of what he had done, Marcus Holt doubled down. He turned to his team. "Finish the sweep. These could be forged." Forged. A federal bar credential with an embossed seal, a judicial identification badge issued by the United States courts. Forged. Caldwell, still pressed against the hood of her own car, in her own driveway, spoke with a voice that carried the weight of 13 years in federal law. You are now searching sealed federal court documents without authorization. Every document in that case is classified. You have committed multiple federal crimes, and every camera on this street is recording you commit them. She was not pleading. She was not negotiating. She was entering evidence in real time, on her own driveway, with her face against the hood. Holt said nothing. His hand was still holding her credentials. The truth was laminated and embossed and sitting in his palm, and he chose to call it a forgery. That was the moment he could never take back. They were still in the driveway. 10 minutes had passed. Caldwell was still in cuffs. The sealed documents were still spread across the trunk. And now Holt was about to learn exactly how far past the line he had gone. Holt stepped away from the driveway and walked toward the lead Suburban. He pulled his phone from his vest pocket and dialed. The neighbor footage captured what followed from a distance, but with perfect clarity. Holt pacing in a tight circle beside the vehicle, his free hand rubbing his forehead, then gripping the back of his neck. His voice rising, the words not fully audible, his gestures sharp and agitated. He was calling his field office supervisor. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When he returned to the driveway, the aggression was still there, buried just beneath the surface, but layered now with something else, something closer to damage control. He walked to Caldwell and unlocked the cuffs. No apology, no acknowledgement, no explanation. He stepped back and said flatly, "There's been a mix-up. You're free to go." Caldwell straightened slowly. She rolled her shoulders, wincing as the left one moved. The bruise from the side mirror was already darkening beneath her jacket. She looked down at her wrists. The cuff marks were deep and red, pressed into her skin like brands. Her glasses lay cracked on the concrete. Her suitcase was open on the driveway, clothes spilling out. Her attaché case had been forced open. Sealed federal documents lay fanned across the trunk, exposed to the morning air, and every camera still recording. She looked directly at Holt. Her voice was steady, controlled, and unmistakable. This was not a mix-up. This was a choice. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out her own phone, and began recording. She panned slowly across the scene, the cuffs on the ground, the scattered documents, the 6 agents standing in a loose formation, none of them making eye contact. The 3 black SUVs still blocking her driveway. The neighbors on the street phones still raised. She narrated as she filmed. Her voice carried the practiced clarity of a woman who understood the power of a record. My name is Denise Caldwell. I am a federal attorney with the United States District Court, Eastern District of Virginia. Today is Saturday. It is approximately 6:30 a.m. I was detained in handcuffs in my own driveway by agents of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. No warrant was presented. No probable cause existed. I was not told what crime I was suspected of. My vehicle was searched without consent. Sealed federal court documents were handled without authorization. She paused. The camera held steady on the driveway. The cuffs, the cracked glasses, the documents on the trunk. I was arrested in my own driveway because I am black. The cameras had been recording since the SUVs arrived. Now the person they had tried to silence was recording them. Toida dokito mokich banang tuing kai badanye. Gio vieteng fan 5 a 6 deo dong nip kitathia lap. Underscore 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 underscore. She didn't leave for the airport. She couldn't. The conference would start without its keynote speaker. Instead, she sat on her front steps, suitcase still open on the driveway, documents still sealed back into the attaché case as best she could, and she made the first call. It was 6:41 in the morning. Colonel Raymond Selby walked across the street and sat beside her on the steps without being asked. He had served 30 years. He knew what paperwork needed to start and when. He dialed a number he had not called in 11 years, a former Pentagon liaison, now a senior official in the Inspector General's office at the Department of Homeland Security. The call lasted 4 minutes. A formal complaint intake was opened before 7 a.m. Professor Irene Chavez called the dean of Georgetown University Law Center from her front porch. Then she called 3 colleagues who covered federal constitutional litigation. She forwarded the video from her phone before the coffee in her kitchen finished brewing. Two houses down, a woman who had lived on that street for 18 years, whose daughter worked the federal beat for the Washington Post, sent every piece of footage she had captured directly to her daughter's cell. The daughter had it in front of a senior editor within 40 minutes. Each call was shorter than the last. Each one carried more urgency. By 7:50 a.m., the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General's office had two separate complaints logged. By 8:15, the Department of Justice had been notified of a potential civil rights violation involving a sitting federal attorney. By 9:02, the FBI's Civil Rights Division received a referral from a source Caldwell had never met someone who had watched the footage on their phone and recognized the statute violations on site. 90 minutes, 4 agencies, and the body cam footage hadn't been pulled yet. At 10:47 that same morning, Marcus Holt filed his incident report. He wrote that the subject had been combative, that she had refused repeated lawful orders. That force used had been proportional to the level of resistance encountered, that agents had acted in accordance with all applicable federal guidelines. The report did not mention the federal bar credential. It did not mention the sealed court documents. It did not mention the 4 phones recording from the street. It did not mention the retired colonel or the constitutional law professor who had cited specific federal statutes to his face. It mentioned none of it because none of it helped him. Agent Lydia Voss reviewed the report. She signed it. Then Holt walked to where Jordan Pace was seated alone at the back of the field office. He placed the report on the table and slid a pen beside it. "Sign it, or your career is over before it starts." Pace looked at the pen. He was 30 years old. He had 14 months of service. He thought about his family. He thought about his mortgage. He thought about the look on Caldwell's face when the cuffs went on. He signed it. That night at 11:18 p.m., from a pay phone outside a gas station 3 miles from his apartment, Jordan Pace called the Inspector General's hotline. He gave his badge number. He gave his field office designation. And he told them everything. The address discrepancy, the credential dismissal, the forced entry of the attaché case, the false report, the pressure to sign. The call was recorded. It was logged. And within 72 hours, it was in front of a federal prosecutor. They were no longer on the driveway. But the driveway was still at the center of everything. 4 days later, a team of FBI agents arrived at Marcus Holt's field office with a federal warrant, the kind he had failed to bring to Denise Caldwell's home. They collected body cameras from all 6 agents present on the morning of the incident. They pulled GPS records from all 3 Suburbans. They secured radio communication logs and internal dispatch records. A forensic analyst mapped the GPS data against the target address listed in Holt's original enforcement order. The number came back within the hour. The address in Holt's operation, file the address he had been given, the address he had been sent to enforce, was 2 miles away from Denise Caldwell's home. He had turned onto the wrong street. He had never verified the location against his paperwork before approaching. There was no warrant for Denise Caldwell. There was no warrant for her address. There was no warrant, active investigation, or any federal enforcement basis connecting her name, her vehicle, or her property to anything in any federal database. He had walked onto her driveway with his hand on his weapon because she was a black woman loading luggage into a car in a neighborhood he didn't expect her to live in, and he had made a decision before he said a single word. The body cam footage confirmed it frame by frame, 7 angles, 0 ambiguity. On the 5th day after the arrest, the neighbor footage went online. Not through a news organization, not through a leak, through a private post that was reshared 17 times in the first hour and then 4 million times in the 12 hours that followed. The clip that spread fastest was 14 seconds long. It showed Holt holding Caldwell's federal bar credential in both hands, reading it, looking at her on the hood of her car, and then turning to his team. The FBI's lead analyst on the case had spent 22 years reviewing use of force incidents and civil rights violations for the federal government. He documented his assessment in a single written line: one of the most clear-cut cases of unlawful arrest, excessive force, and false reporting I have reviewed in my career. By the end of that week, a Senate subcommittee had announced hearings. 3 senior officials at ICE's Enforcement Division had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and every major wire service in the country had Denise Caldwell's name in a headline. The grand jury handed down indictments 6 weeks later. Marcus Holt was charged on 4 counts: deprivation of rights under color of law assault on a federal officer, falsification of federal records, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Lydia Voss was charged on 3. Jordan Pace was granted full immunity in exchange for his testimony. The trial ran 3 weeks. The jury watched the body cam footage on a courtroom screen, synchronized from all 7 angles, with GPS overlay and timestamp. Denise Caldwell took the stand on the final day. She had no notes. She had not prepared remarks. She stood at the witness stand the way she had stood in her driveway, spine straight. Voice steady, hands still. She described what the cold metal of the hood felt like against her cheek. She described the sound her glasses made when they hit the concrete. She described the specific weight of handcuffs ratcheted beyond functional restraint. She described looking at her own wrists afterward and seeing the marks and understanding with the precision of someone who had spent 13 years in federal law, every single statute that had been violated in the producing of those marks. And at the end, she paused. I have spent my entire career upholding the Constitution of the United States. I have won cases that protected strangers I will never meet. I have argued before federal judges for the rights of people whose names I cannot pronounce. She looked directly at the jury. That morning, I learned how it feels when the Constitution fails to protect you. The courtroom was silent for several seconds after she finished. Marcus Holt received 7 years in federal prison for what he did in 11 minutes on that driveway. Was that enough? Drop your answer in the comments below. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Marcus Holt guilty on all 4. 7 years in a federal correctional facility. His 18-year federal pension was immediately forfeited by statute. A federal conviction for civil rights violations terminates retirement benefits. His name entered the National Federal Inmate Database, permanently indexed, permanently searchable, permanently attached to what he chose to do on a Saturday morning at 6:22 a.m. Lydia Voss guilty on 3 counts, 3 years, barred from federal employment for life. The field office director who had supervised Holt's unit for 4 years, who had documented 9 complaints and acted on none of them, was transferred to an administrative position in a different division. No announcement, no press release. A quiet reassignment that told the story of institutional accountability all by itself. 9 complaints, not one acted upon. Careers ended, millions spent. And all of it preventable if someone in that chain had picked up a single complaint and done something with it. The civil suit settled for $4.6 million. But Denise Caldwell's attorney made clear in every post-settlement statement what the headline should actually be. The money was not the outcome. The consent decree was the outcome. ICE's enforcement division in the district was required to implement mandatory civilian oversight for all enforcement operations. Address verification against warrant documentation became a mandatory checkpoint at every stage of a field operation, not advisory, not encouraged, mandatory. Implicit bias training shifted from annual to quarterly. A prohibition was placed on enforcement actions at addresses not specifically named in valid warrants. An independent review board was given authority to examine all use of force reports within 48 hours of filing. The reforms covered every agent in the district. The training changes were being considered for nationwide implementation. 1 woman, 11 minutes, 7 cameras, in a federal system that slowly, imperfectly, belatedly had to look at itself and change. 6 months after the trial, Jordan Pace received a commendation from the Inspector General's Office for integrity demonstrated under extraordinary professional pressure. He was transferred to a new field office. He did not speak publicly about what happened. He didn't need to. The record spoke. Denise Caldwell returned to practice. She declined every interview request, every television appearance, every podcast, every documentary inquiry. She had said what needed to be said from the witness stand. What she did instead was establish a legal defense fund for individuals subjected to unlawful federal enforcement actions who could not afford representation. The fund was named after her father, who had been wrongfully arrested in 1971 and who had never seen a courtroom outcome that looked like justice. She had spent her entire career trying to build the world her father never got to live in. She was still building it. At the federal legal conference, rescheduled 6 weeks after the original date, she finally delivered her keynote. The subject was constitutional protections and immigration enforcement. She had been the keynote speaker when the conference was scheduled. She walked to the podium without notes. The room was full of federal attorneys, judges, law professors, and practitioners who had followed every detail of what had happened in her driveway. She looked out at them for a moment before she spoke. The law failed me that morning. A pause. But the people did not. One young agent made a single phone call that changed the entire outcome. If you believe these stories need to be told, share this video. Subscribe if you're here for the first time. These cases don't survive without visibility. And before you go, what would you have done if you were Agent Pace standing at the back of that driveway at 6:30 in the morning, pen in your hand, career on the line? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.